Pop your head into any dozen Active Directory infrastructures, and it's likely you'll find more than a few that have kind of just forgotten about sites and services. I think said that last nugget that in the beginnings of Active Directory, everybody was very concerned with creating Active Directory structures like domains, like trusts, like sites. But as time has gone on, and we are now more than a decade away from the introduction of Active Directory, people just kind of forgot about them, particularly in locations where Microsoft Exchange has not been employed. You may know that Microsoft Exchange sites and Active Directory sites are one and the same these days. And so you use your Exchange or your Active Directory site structure as a mechanism to help you route mail around your network. Well, if you don't do that, or if you've forgotten about it, or if you don't have Exchange, or you just really don't like dealing with sites, it's entirely likely that the geographic structure of your Active Directory infrastructure is probably not aligned with the geographic structure of your network, the site structure of your network. So here again is our domain company.p, company.pri. Company.pri has four different domain controllers. There's a domain controller called DEN-DC1. There's DEN-DC2. These are the two obviously in Denver. There's LAS DC1 and PHX DC1. So Las Vegas, Phoenix, and then these two here in Denver. And I've created them with this naming structure so you could at least highlight the geographic separation of locations for our little company here, company.pri. When we start talking about sites, we are very much talking about those geographic locations here. So here's Denver. I'm using airport codes here, but I got my two domain controllers here in Denver. And then here's my Phoenix location. I got my one domain controller there, which actually is a read-only domain controller. And then over here, I've also got my Las Vegas location with the one domain controller there as well. After I get done creating the domain, one of the next steps in the process is to ensure that this geographic distribution is configured appropriately to support very specifically the replication traffic between these different locations. Now it's here where I kind of got to stop and put all of this in perspective. When you're talking about replication traffic on today's networks, in a lot of situations, the amount of stuff that has to go from this location to this location is probably far less than your average daily, I'm just surfing on my computer traffic that I have to deal with. And so remember, Active Directory is more than a decade old. It is ancient at this point in technology speak. And so the creation of sites and services is done in many ways to address a problem that does not exist in a lot of networks today. If the site link between Denver and Phoenix is a 10 megabit link between these two locations, my guess is that the throttling your Active Directory replication traffic is not something that you really have to be concerned about because there's such a big pipe between these two locations that it's just not going to matter. But if from Denver to Las Vegas, that pipe is, I don't know, it's less than a T1. It's a frame relay connection. It's zero point 0.1 megabit per second. In those circumstances, that's where the actual replication of Active Directory stuff can be a bit of a burden on just allowing these two sites to communicate with each other. So again, put this in perspective because it is probably more likely that your infrastructure lies maybe towards the higher end of traffic capability than does it the much, much lower end of traffic capability. Remember, Active Directory came out in the previous century, so it's been around for a long time. What we have to do, however, at this point is to configure the sites, and that is literally to identify what the sites are. We have to identify the linkages between those sites and how we want to address any throttling of that replication traffic. And then we also have to identify which domain controllers belong in which sites. We're going to do that by configuring sites. We're going to set up the subnets, right? Our Denver net is our one net. Our Las Vegas net is our, whoops, I forgot which one the Vegas net is. Vegas net is our 2 net, and our Phoenix net is our 3 net. So 192, 168, 1.0, 2.0, and 3.0. Once we have the sites and subnets set up, we will identify a variety of site links. So that's the arrows here. And define properties on those site links to determine how expensive it is to send data across, the cost. And then also any delay. So do we want to set it up so it only replicates in the evening? That allows us to manage the site coverage. And this is sort of a kind of an odd requirement here, because managing the site coverage is just ensuring that all of my geographic locations are supported by the domain controllers that I have. And then once we've done that, we'll put the domain controllers there into the appropriate site. The other thing that we have to be conscious about when we're doing all this site work is for all the workstations and all the people that are sitting around in these different locations, it is the site structure which helps their clients identify which domain controller they should point to first for authentication. So in this location right here, where LAS is down, and if I have a 0.1 megabit connection here, but another 10 megabit connection in this direction, well, it's probably a good idea for the user to authenticate in that direction if we should lose that domain controller, instead of trying to hop through this very small network link. So useful here for ensuring, number one, that your replication occurs, and number two, that if some kind of problem happens, well, that I end up redirecting those clients to the next best possible domain controller wherever it may be on the planet. If you think also about global environments, now we're talking here about 3 locations in the United States, but if I start talking about a global Active Directory where I've got domain controllers in Ireland, in Hyderabad, India, here in the United States, and so on, these links can get much smaller still. So those of us that are dealing with Active Directory in a global type environment are probably going to spend more time ensuring that sites and services are absolutely correct than those of us that have pretty decent links between the 2 sites. Now, the last topic in this nugget that we have to talk about is the registration of SRV records. This is technically a DNS topic. It kind of should be in the DNS nugget, but it's here because we're talking about site services and the way in which we resolve site services, which is done by by managing the SRV records in DNS. Hold on to that. I'll explain exactly what that will involve here in just a minute. So let's step through the activity of getting our domain here, the company.pri, configured appropriately for the different geographic sites that we have. I want to pop over here to Tools and Active Directory Sites and Services and take a look at, right out of the box, what a domain looks like when you first bring it into being. This is our domain, company.pri. We have one site here, and the default first site name is the lovingly named first site. And it is here where our domain controllers are going to be located until they are very specifically manually moved into the appropriate site for their location. But we have to create those sites. And in addition to creating the sites, we have to create the subnets as well that are going to associate with each site. We also have to identify the linkages between the sites. So we got a couple of different tasks that we have to accomplish here in order to get these 3 things piecemealed out to mirror what our geographic site configuration looks like. We'll start by creating the sites. Right click here, and I'm going to create 3 sites, also corresponding with the airport codes for these 3. I'll start by creating the Denver site, and for now, just for now, I'm going to associate it to the default IP site link. This is just so I can get them created here at this point. So I'll hit OK here, and that's fine. And I want to create also a new site called Phoenix. There's PHX. And then I also want to create a site for Las Vegas, so LAS. Now, for each of these, remember, we have to have domain controllers that are going to go in these locations. It doesn't make any sense for me to create sites and subnets if there's not domain controllers that will ultimately be placed there. So don't sweat this if you've got other locations that don't have DCs, or if you don't have Exchange services that you have to worry about. That's another topic for another series, but Exchange services using these can be a secondary reason why you would create new sites. With these 3 sites now created, I next need to create the subnets that they will be associated with. So here for the subnets, we will do new subnet, and the prefix will be 192.168.1.0/24. So my prefix here, 1.0/24, is going to be associated with my Denver site. There's Denver. And then we'll do this again for, oops, not there. We'll do it again for 192.168 2.0/24 for the Las Vegas site there. Do it a 3rd time here for subnets, and then 192.168 3.0/24 for the Phoenix site. So there we have it. right? I have 3 different subnets here. Each one of these subnets is associated with a site, and I can change that if I want by adjusting the drop-down here. I can adjust the prefix here as well if I want to. Now recognize that we're just doing this at this point. Let me draw because I think it'll be easier for you to kind of comprehend. We are at this point creating thus. There's our domain. I have created this site, so this is the Denver one. I've created this site, the Las Vegas one, and I've created the site, this is the Phoenix site, and that's all that I've done. The next thing I have to do is to identify what I want to set up as the transport to get the data from this location to this location. That can happen either through an IP site link or, rarely to the point of almost never being used, an SMTP site link as well. I will show you the IP site links because they are, in 99.9% of the cases, the kinds of site links that are used almost everywhere. In this case, I have to create multiple different site links, one to correspond with each of the different connections here, because these site links are where I can apply the configurations that define the quality of the network connection between those 2 locations. Now, you can get an example of how this looks just right out of the box when I look at the servers themselves. So on each server itself is a subfolder here called NTDS settings, and you'll notice that automatically I actually have a link that is created, a couple of links here that are created by the knowledge consistency checker to go about propagating the replication stuff around. So from LAS and from DEN, DC2, I'm getting replication. Okay, inbound replication from these 2 locations. It's coming from default first site name, the location. If I wanted to, I could adjust where my replication is coming from by actually changing the location here. So where do I want that replication to come from? Before I do that, however, let's go about creating the different site links up here. This is the default site link right here, because I want to create different site links that correspond with the sites in each, with the different sites, and not the individual domain controllers. Let me say that again. I'm more interested in controlling the sites to site configuration and not the domain controller to domain controller configuration. This makes a lot more sense when I have 35 DCs and I just want to make sure that I got my sites correctly configured. As I start getting into individual configurations down here, that's when things can get a little squirrely. So let me go up here to IP, and I'm going to create a new site link here. And this will be the DEN to LAS site link. So we'll add these 2 locations in here. Okay, a site link has to have at least 2 because I'm linking literally these 2 sites. Then I have to do, let's see, should there be 3 of these? So then I do DEN to PHX. So Denver to Phoenix, there's 1. And then I'm going to do new site link LAS to PHX, which completes the 3rd of these 3 site links. As you can imagine, it's awesome whenever I can draw these things out, so to visualize them, because as is, they can be a little challenging for me to understand. These site links now, each individual site link is going to determine what the parameters of replication are going to be. It's down here at the bottom where this really kind of gets configured. This first item is what's called the cost. And the value here for the cost, the fact that it's set to 100, is unimportant, except when compared with the values for the other costs. So see here, this is set to 100 and this is set to 100 here. The reason why these are set up with a cost, that the absolute value is unimportant, it's the relative value, is so I can make a kind of a subjective guess about whether one site may be a little bit more expensive from a network perspective or computationally to replicate traffic around than another. I mean, if I told you exactly how many dollars does it take to replicate your Active Directory from Phoenix to Las Vegas, you couldn't probably tell me. But in the back of your mind, you probably knew that, you know what, that LAS to Phoenix site, it's really the narrowest of my 3 pipes that I have between these 3 locations. So if I drop this down to maybe 50, that means that it's twice as expensive, or excuse me, it's actually not 50, it'd be 200. It's twice as expensive for me to replicate over this link than it is over the other links. Now this sets up an interesting thing. So let's say I set it to 250, for example, and then let me go and then redraw this. These costs begin to get much more complicated as you start thinking about larger environments. So if from Denver to Las Vegas, if this is 100 for the cost, and if Denver to Phoenix is set to 100, well, my Las Vegas to Phoenix here, if I set it to 250, it actually costs less for the data to go hop, hop, because I've set it up this way. So depending on how you adjust these things, you can have some unexpected consequences for how long it takes data to replicate from one location to the other. So be careful with these things. In addition to setting what the cost is, you can also set how often you want replication to occur. Now, if you remember back when we were talking about implementing a forest or domain, and we were going through that AD prep stuff, and I said, hey, by the way, be careful here with AD prep, because when you run the forest prep command, you want to give it a little time for Active Directory replication to complete before you start doing things like domain prep. Well, this is one reason why that can be the case. If I've got 180 minutes to complete a replication between replication intervals, that's 3 hours. So I probably am going to need to wait a period of time for this whole network to reconverge after any major changes have occurred. This can be even further exacerbated if I change the schedule so that replication is unavailable during certain periods of time, like during the day, for example. So if I want to just set this and throttle it down so that my replication only happens at night, and then even then only so often, I can do so. But remember again, all of these configurations were originally designed for an era where networks were not nearly as robust as they are today. So again, they're there for you, but be very careful about how you set these up, because more often than not with these, you end up having unintended consequences. Your network these days is probably more powerful than the networks that you had back in the year 2000. Now the last piece of this puzzle is, once we've got all the links configured, we have to then go about taking these servers and dragging these servers into the appropriate sites. I got my Denver servers here, so DEN DC1 needs to go in the Denver location, DEN DC2 also into the Denver location, LAS into the Las Vegas location, and Phoenix into the Phoenix location, and bam, we're done. We now have our sites and services configuration set up appropriately for our geographic locations. And as you can see here now, I've got the servers that have been configured. One little piece of trivia, if you are looking for turning on different servers as global catalogs, it is here under NTDS settings where I can identify whether this server is a global catalog or not. See here, these are set up all as global catalogs. Another interesting piece of trivia as well is to recognize that the NTDS settings here, notice how these are different. The NTDS settings are different from the NTDS settings that are found here, the site settings. So these site settings are going to be slightly different, what you can do here, than what you get by looking at the individual NTDS settings for the server. Now the completion of these tasks actually takes us through, it looks like, the first 4 of the 5 different items that we have to work on here in this nugget. We've worked with the sites and subnets and did the site links and talked about coverage and moved some DCs between sites. But there is also the situation where, again, in my infrastructure, I've got a site here and I don't have, I'm not worried about inter-site replication. I'm worried about the intra-site sort of replication, or maybe not replication, but the services in a single site. Maybe for some reason or another, I bought not 2 computers that are the same size, but I actually bought one computer that is the world's beefiest, most powerful Active Directory domain controller, and one that is the world's very tiniest one, for one reason or another. They're way, misaligned in their specifications. Well, it's probably good for me to send my clients to the big, beefy, super powerful one than is it the little, pequeña, tiny, unpowerful one. But I still have to have 2 DCs there to ensure, if I lose a domain controller, that I've still got the ability to authenticate my users. Well, there is one, and I will tell you this is kind of a hack, but it's something you can do to adjust the priority of where your clients are going to request certain Active Directory services. And that happens back here in DNS. So let's say, for example, that I do have that situation where Denver DC2 is one that I only want the clients to go to that location or to go to that server in the case where the primary server is offline. I want to set up kind of a little failover situation. One way in which I can accomplish that comes down here with all the different services that exist here sub to my company.pri zone. So let's say, for example, let's just pick one at random here. Not that one. Here. Let's say, for example, that I have, here's DEN DC1 and LAS DC1 and Denver DEC2. See how this underscore LDAP and underscore Kerberos records are here in this little subzone for TCP? If I wanted to prioritize or reprioritize the traffic so that we always sent our LDAP traffic that's going to this location to this server, I could possibly do so by clicking onto the properties of the object and adjusting the weight of the SRV record here. In the real world, you would probably never do this, but it is something that's possible for you to do, and it may be something that you need to be aware of when it comes time for dealing with test questions. I don't know. But this is one way in which you can manage the coverage of the site even when you have domain controllers in the same site. So dealing with the Active Directory domain services in that same location. So possibility there for you to adjust the weighting of these records, maybe some priority changes here. In that case where you perhaps have the wrong size spec for your different domain controllers. So what have we talked about in this nugget? We have talked about configuring sites. And as I think we've all come to figure out, dealing with sites is a lot more interesting than dealing with domains, I guess. Well, it's definitely less complicated, we'll call it that. Because with sites, you kind of have the much better ability to visualize your site structure because it's based off of your geographic structure of your network. We took a look at configuring sites and subnets. We looked at site links as well and how those go into the process of managing your site coverage. We moved some domain controllers around between sites and then took a look at the registration of our SRV records with the look at how you might adjust perhaps some priority information in there to ensure that your clients are going to the right location. Little piece of trivia here with SRV records too. If you're ever having problems with your SRV records, the ipconfig/register DNS command is your friend. Because if you're a domain controller, you have all those DNS records in there that have to be managed for finding your services. Gosh, it's nice when the domain controller automatically registers its own records when you use that command. Well, again, another little piece of trivia there for you because it's something I use all the time whenever we have domain issues. Coming up next, we are going to focus on Active Directory and sysvol replication. In a world where I have multiple domain controllers that are all transferring data around, there can come a situation where that transfer just has problems, has issues. And managing that replication and discovering the tools you can use to see that replication is something that you need to know for the management of your domain and you need to know for the exam. That's the topic for our next nugget. So until then, I hope this has been informative for you and I'd like to thank you for viewing.